Secundus came from a large family. There weren't any words in English that translated precisely, except for the word family. Cybertronians did not reproduce the same way humans did. They built their children, programmed them, and brought them to life with the Allspark, or a Vector Sigma if they were old-fashioned. Two or more Transformers could make a pact, a vow, to raise one or more children together. These weren't romantic relationships in the way humans think of them, but they are still relationships. Cybertronians understand friendship and brotherly, sisterly love, love between parent and a child, even love in its ultimate form, self-sacrificial love. They don't experience romance the way humans do, but they do understand love. Without romance cluttering their view of it, they may have a better understanding of love than most humans. Maybe not better. Maybe more abstract? Whatever. Transformers knew love. Transformers had families. Secundus had parents, his grandparents, his great-grandparents, aunts, uncles, and all sorts of variations on the theme, all going back over 10 generations. In the other direction, too. Children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and then there were all of his brothers and sisters and co-parents. Secundus had over 1,000 living relatives, knew them all by name, and had spent years living with each and every one of them. Had. Had was the operative word. They're all offline now. All of them were just a processor and a spark chamber sitting on a shelf in one of the many storage facilities across the 13 continents of Cybertron. They had all been online before the war. But now, the ground shook beneath Secundus, rousing him from his musings and meditations. He had been resting in his alt form, but the ground kept shaking, so he transformed to robot mode and left his room in their underground base. The hallway was empty. Where was everyone? Grinder, Grunt, or Forager would be on watch on the surface. Whichever one was on watch would determine where the other two were. One would be on watch, one would be asleep. Yes, Transformers slept. And one would be on downtime. Secundus didn't have any of them running missions right now. The current strategy the few remaining Autobot resistance cell had agreed on, was a waiting game against the Decepticons. As far as they could tell, there weren't any normal Decepticons left, only Viacons. Far too many Viacons. But in a few decades, a century on the outside, the Viacons would run through their Energon supplies. Some of them had already gone offline from lack of Energon. Viacons knew nothing of creation or industry. They used up their Energon cubes instead on allowing them to recharge or actively recharging them. That meant the war was effectively over. The Autobots would win. As long as they didn't fight. The Decepticons had the numbers, and the weapons, and the desire to fight, but they didn't have the Energon. So Secundus' standing orders were simple. Stay in the base, keep a constant watch, stay hidden. Suffice it to say, they had all gone stir-crazy since these orders were given. Stir-crazy, a little depressed, definitely getting on each other's nerves, but alive. Most Transformers could speak. Most had the equivalent of vocal cords with their metal muscles or a speaker system. There were pros and cons to both, and before the war it was a mildly debated topic between bots as to which was better. But both required sound to communicate, and sound required air. Air, atmosphere, whatever you want to call it. Sound needed a medium to travel through, preferably a gaseous one. Transformers didn't need an atmosphere to survive, and some had spent millennia on the vacuum of space. So long ago, ages before Secundus had come online, the Cybertronians had chosen to make AM radio waves their main form of communication. Secundus used a standard AM radio frequency to communicate with everyone in the base at once. Sit rep! Secundus was using shorthand to ask for a report on his soldiers' current situation. On watch, Forager said. No Decepticons. Common room. Grinder replied. No damage from the quake. Yet. Grinder was not an optimist. Medward secure, Doc called in. All clear here too. There was a pause over the air as they all waited for Grunt to call in. Secundus was the one to break the silence. Where's Grunt? He's scheduled for bunk time. Grinder didn't have anything nice to say about anyone. Leave it to a protoform to sleep through his ruckus. Protoform? Forager asked. He's not an infant, Grinder. Close enough, Grinder replied. I'd ask what the Allspark programmed him with when it brought Grunt online, but frankly, I don't think there's much data left in his processor to program. Hey! Forager shot back. He had enough brainpower to drag your broken body off the battlefield. You after a year lying broken and offline under the rubble. Oh, and by the way, Doc, thanks for reformatting me into this tiny little chassis. Doc's laugh carried through the airways. Happy to help. Doc wasn't stupid. He was the smartest boss Secundus had ever met, so it was obvious to all of them that he was deliberately ignoring Grinder's sarcasm and answering his comment at face value. Take it off the air, Autobots, Secundus transmitted, shutting down the gripe session. Save the airways for emergencies. I'll go check on Grunt. His orders didn't end the argument. Grinder and Forager hopped over to a different frequency. Secundus could feel the conversation going on in a way that's hard to explain to humans. He could feel their transmissions, and it would be child's play to tune them in, but he couldn't hear what they were saying unless he chose to tune in. Frankly, he didn't want to hear an argument he had already heard 1,000 times. Grunt wasn't very smart, but all of them owed him their lives. Grunt was strong, but as big as his muscles were, his heart was so much bigger. Grunt had served under Secundus longer than the rest of the crew. They'd been serving together since the first days of the war. Secundus hadn't gone up much in rank, but Grunt hadn't gone up at all. Grunt was still a private, second class. Secundus mused that he could promote Grunt now as high as he liked. Sadly, as a first lieutenant, Secundus was one of the last officers left in the Autobot army. The war really was coming to a slow, grinding halt. Attriting? Whatever the verb was, they were doing it. The large Autobot made his way down the hall. Walking was much harder with the ground shaking beneath him. What was causing this earthquake, and why wasn't it ending? A few yards away from Grunt's room, Secundus lost his balance and dropped to one knee. He took a moment, regaining his sense of balance before he stood up. He waited another moment, one hand on the wall, making sure he was stable before he finished his miniature sojourn. 2 cautious half-steps took Secundus to Grunt's door. He knocked, one hand on the wall for balance. No answer. Secundus slowly got his hand on the doorknob, turned it, and looked inside. Grunt was inside, in his alt form, a repulsor truck, all exterior lights off, floating serenely a foot or 2 off the ground. No wonder why the earthquake didn't wake Grunt up. Did all Transformers sleep in their alt form? Secundus did. Well, most of the time. It was more peaceful, less moving parts, something to ponder. He certainly had the time. Secundus closed the door, grinning without realizing it. Grunt's simplicity tended to have that effect on him. He broadcast over the emergency frequency. Grunt is fine. He's racked out again, isn't he? Grinder's question wasn't quite a demand. He is, Secundus said, knowing the argument was just going to flare up again. Sure enough, Forager chimed in, defending Grunt. 1 second. Secundus tuned them out. The truth was, Grinder liked Grunt more than he liked anyone else in the crew, while Forager could hardly stand to spend time with Grunt. The two were most likely arguing to vent a little steam. Being cooped up was driving them all to climb the walls. Secundus slowly walked through the medical ward where Doc was waiting out the quake. About halfway there, the ground finally stopped shaking. Secundus found himself grinning again. He finished the distance to the med ward and a few of his gigantic steps. All right, Doc? He asked as he entered the room. Doc was sitting at a desk against the wall. He was the smallest Transformer Secundus had ever seen, maybe 7 feet tall, small even for a Class 1. He'd known larger fleshlings back before the war. Secundus was a Class 3 and stood about 40 feet tall, easily the largest Autobot in their crew. There wasn't a chair large enough for him in the med ward, so Secundus sat on one of the beds for the injured. Doc turned to face him. Technically, Doc outranked Secundus by quite a bit, but he was a medical officer not in the chain of command. During a medical emergency, Doc could take command, but otherwise, Secundus made all the decisions. It had been a bit rocky at first. Finding the balance between them had taken some time, especially in a search and rescue team, but they worked it out. A long time back, before the last Prime, Optimus had left to save Cybertron from a wayward meteor storm. Secundus and his crew defended a hospital from the Terracons. Doc was the only doctor left working in the hospital, and on Megatron's direct orders, the Terracons were to kidnap him. At that point in time, there weren't many doctors left on Cybertron. It was one of the few times his crew had seen combat before Optimus left, and it was a clean success. Doc and his handful of nurses had gotten away clean. Forager and Secundus had evacuated the patients that could walk on their own, all while Grunt held off Abominus by himself. Class 2 like Grunt going toe-to-toe with a Class 4 Gestalt combiner. Secundus had been sure Grunt was sacrificing himself to buy a little time to finish the evac, and Secundus didn't let that sacrifice go to waste. 5 days later, Grunt showed up at their base, not even a scratch in his paint, apologizing. Seems he would have gotten there sooner if he hadn't gotten lost. Doc had asked Grunt how he had escaped Abominus. Grunt just shrugged. Apparently the fight was easy. Navigating was hard. Energon chip for your thoughts, Doc asked. Secundus smiled. I could use the Energon. I was thinking about how we met. The hospital, Abominus. Doc let out a laugh. The fight was easy. Navigating is hard. Secundus nodded, yeah. And now he's sleeping through an earthquake. He was in his alt form, wasn't he? Yeah, Secundus said, arcing an eyebrow in wonder. How did you know? Doc shrugged. 84.73% of Cybertronians sleep in alt forms. I read a few studies. Doc read everything, or close to it. And his repulsors would have kept him from feeling the earthquake. We're running out of energon, Doc. Why would you assume Grunt wouldn't turn off his repulsors to save power? We aren't running out of energon. The Decepticons are. Repulsors are incredibly low energy to start with. Besides, Doc shot Secundus a big smile. Grunt has 3 solar ports. He has energon to spare. I've been making him donate energon to keep my backup supplies filled. Secundus didn't know that. He knew the crew all had solar ports, tools that turned light into energon. He had made sure of it when they had adopted the new strategy of letting the Decepticons wind down. Solar ports were uncommon. Before the war, the Allspark supplied energon across all of Cybertron, so not too many bots had them. It was the bots who spent time away from Cybertron that tended to get them. It was easier than depending on fleshling sources of energon. Forager, as an interstellar explorer, already had one. Secundus knew Grunt had one from his days as a long hauler on fleshling worlds, though Secundus didn't know why he would want 3. What was he trying to be, a power master? Doc used to be a scholar who spent centuries traveling to schools and libraries on 1,000 worlds. Secundus got his installed after Grimlock stole the Allspark and disappeared into hyperspace. Seemed like a wise precaution. Secundus had ordered Grinder to get one installed when they put the new strategy into effect. Grinder had complained about it at least once a day since. That was normal, though. Secundus was certain Grinder was only happy when he was complaining. They didn't have any spare solar ports, so Doc had to fabricate a solar port for Grinder. Doc could make anything. With enough parts and time. Absolutely anything. What caused the earthquake, Doc? The fight between Scorponok and Fortress Maximus. How much you want to bet? Secundus shook his head. Those 2 titans killed each other in solo combat over a century ago. The explosion that ended the fight destroyed a city. How's that, Doc? I've long theorized that last fight of theirs put a hole in the continental shelf. I never had time to go explore the crater, and no one has filed a report on the geological ramifications. 2 city guardians, the largest, most powerful 2 city guardians ever brought online, fighting to the death? That's going to have consequences on the planetary level. Okay, Secundus rubbed his temples. How do we prove it, and how do we figure out how to stop it? Send Forager. He's a trained geologist. Primus knows he would like to get some time out of the base. I think this is the longest he's been inside in his entire life. Of course, that's the wrong question. Secundus closed his eyes while he rubbed his temples. Doc used to hit him with that line all the time. What was he missing? Secundus reviewed all the data he had. After a minute, he gave up. What's the right question? What did the earthquake expose? All this rubble on Cybertron's surface, an earthquake that long, something might have been exposed. There might be survivors. Doc's voice had a mild, pleading tone to it. It took Secundus a long time to learn to recognize it. Doc didn't plead very often. It didn't take a genius to figure it out. Doc was a doctor. If there were bots to save, then he wanted to save them. What about the earthquakes? Secundus asked. Doc waved his hand dismissively. They'll continue or they won't. The continent will stay together, it will break up. That's a problem centuries, if not millennia away. Well out of our league. But if there are survivors out there... We're a search and rescue unit, Secundus. We're a military unit in the middle of a war, Secundus countered. Scouting across the continent goes directly against the current strategy. We could send Grunt. All the Decepticons online couldn't scratch his finish. Secundus laughed. He's strong, but he's not that strong. Besides, there's a reason we don't use Grunt for scouting missions. Doc laughed. Yeah, fighting is easy. Navigating is hard. They finished the quote together. Secundus sighed. If we send Forager, and that's a big if we send Forager, then he needs to stay within range of Grinder's rifle or mine. We go out in pairs, maybe all three of us, maybe Grunt too. I'm not losing a single bot. Doc nodded, smiling. Of course. I'll coordinate with Forager and work a plan for search grids off some maps. I'll have to recalibrate the Energon scanners. We'll need to make new maps after that earthquake. Doc's grin got wider. Can you even imagine what we might find? As long as it's not Decepticon docs, I want us all to get through this war alive. And that was the story Secundus Came from a Large Family, part 1 of the My Cybertronian story arc here. I hope you enjoyed it. All you Blam Blam truckers out there, keep on trucking.